Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video, where today we're going to be talking about the case of the Lady of the Dunes, a mysterious Jane Doe case that's lasted over 45 years. Our story begins near Race Point, in the Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, USA. It was the afternoon of the 26th of July 1974 when a teenage girl was walking her dog along the Cape Cod National Seashore, and she comes across a fairly decomposed dead body. The body was positioned as if it had been simply sunbathing, lying face down on half a beach towel, with her head resting on her folded jeans. Except she wasn't just sunbathing. Her hands were missing and her head had been almost severed from her body, as well as the left side of her skull being crushed. The girl contacted the police, who arrived at the scene quickly. This woman, whoever she was estimated to be between 20 to 49 years old. She was white, between 5'6" and 5'8", around 145 pounds, with auburn hair that had been pulled back into a ponytail and tied with an elastic hair tie with gold-coloured flecks. She was noted to have an athletic build and her toenails were painted pink. And she had also had extensive dental work done in her life, with gold crowns on her teeth that would have been worth anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000 at the time. The dental work was done in what dentists refer to as New York style. Several teeth had also been removed, presumably by her killer. Her fingerprints were obviously not available as her hands had been removed, and the only clothing nearby was a pair of Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana, which were both found underneath the victim's heads. The beach towel the body was found on was light green and heavy cotton, and there was nothing else found at the scene, not even a sign of a struggle. The pine needles underneath her body were relatively undisturbed and there were no huge marks in the sand. The autopsy found no sign of drugs or alcohol in her system, and her cause of death was thought to be homicide by blunt force trauma to the head, the left side of her skull being crushed. In fact, a chunk of the skull the size of a hand had been destroyed, and there was a jagged 8-inch crack running across the top of it. The amount of brute force that's required to cause that kind of damage to a human skull is incredible. This was said to be the cause of death, despite the fact that she was almost decapitated, which investigators speculate to be because of how strongly she'd been strangled. The murder weapon is thought to be a military entrenching tool or something similar, although of course nothing was found at the scene. Jane Doe's estimated date of death is thought to be anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks before she was found, and her remains were not in a good state. Doe Network reports that she was decomposing and putrefaction was taking place, and this was towards the end of July and it was incredibly hot, forcing the decomposition to speed up. Insects, June flies, had also started to do their thing on the body. This level of decomposition, specifically on her face, meant that she was pretty much unrecognisable by the time she was found. She had also been sexually assaulted with some kind of wooden object, although it seems that this took place after her death. Provincetown at this point was a fairly quiet town in terms of crime. It had quite a lively nightlife, but crime? Not really. Things like this simply didn't happen. Murders were unusual and it shocked everyone. The Provincetown police chief at the time was James J. Mead, and he said this is the one mystery that he always vowed to solve, leaving no stone unturned. He served as police chief for 22 years and sadly died aged 78 in 2011, with the Lady of the Dunes mystery still unsolved. But Mead always believed that Jane Doe knew her attacker and that she was potentially killed when she was asleep. They've always worked under the assumption that the attacker specifically cut Jane Doe's hands off because they knew that she had a criminal record and therefore would have been able to be identified via her hands. And it's also likely that only somebody who knew the woman quite well would know that she had a criminal record. Of course, the reason her hands were taken may have been different, maybe there's some kind of trophy, but the likelihood is there was a practical reason why the killer removed them. She also had several missing teeth, like I said, freshly removed, and investigators think the reasoning for this was similar. She could have been identified via dental records, and removing a few teeth would make this a little bit more difficult. To me, this suggests that whoever killed this Jane Doe had a bit more than a basic understanding of forensic science, even for the 70s. Just a pondering that I have in regards to this is that whoever killed Jane Doe went to the effort of removing her hands and teeth to ensure that she wasn't identified. It was above and beyond. This to me suggests that Jane Doe may not have had many relatives or friends who may have recognised her. It was kind of like covering up her face was a secondary thought here. This killer was more worried about the law enforcement identifying her with her fingerprints or her dental records. They clearly weren't particularly worried about the body being found either. It was obvious it was going to be found pretty soon because there was no attempt made to bury or hide it. It was just lying in the dunes. Plus, it was probably important to the killer that Jane Doe wasn't identified because her identification would have led straight to them. Why else would a random murderer go to so much effort to make sure they couldn't find out who she was? Every single abandoned bicycle and vehicle in the area was looked at and the owners were traced, as well as looking at every single vehicle that had been legally driven out on the dunes in the few weeks prior to the body being found, but nothing led to any leads. As part of the investigation, Jane Doe's teeth and skull were reconstructed in an attempt to find matching dental records. Thousands of dentists nationwide were contacted in an effort to find the one who had done the expensive dental work in this New York style. I tried to find out exactly what New York style entails here, whether it was actual dentistry done in New York, or if it was just a style that happened to have the name New York for another reason, but I couldn't find any answers online. If anyone happens to know what New York style dentistry is, then please feel free to stick the answer in the comments down below. Articles on this case got published in dental journals and police and detective magazines nationwide, looking for any leads or any help. A forensic anthropologist created a clay model of the woman's features, and artist renderings of this were circulated worldwide. Police Chief Meade appeared in national magazines and on television begging for anyone who knew anything to come forward, and he travelled across North America for many years following any leads he got in this case. But of course, nothing led to anything. He did receive thousands of letters and phone calls over the years, some with potential answers as to Jane Doe's identity, but each time he would ask family members to supply dental records to see if there was a match, but there never was. At one point, Meade even turned to a psychic to help, who told him that he would find the hands buried under a building at a certain address. They followed through on this, and it turned out the owners had dug a cellar at this address just the previous year and no bones were found. After a while, it became clear that this was going to be a cold case. There were literally no leads to be followed, nothing to investigate. No one had been reported missing in the area that matched up with the description of the Lady of the Dunes, as she was soon dubbed. She was buried in October 1974 in St. Peter's Cemetery in Provincetown, her headstone simply reading, "Unidentified female." She was buried minus her skull though, which sat in a cardboard box in the corner of Meade's office for years, awaiting an identity. According to Dr. Stanley Schwartz, the dental forensic examiner who pieced Jane Doe's skull and teeth back together, someone placed a small vase and flowers at the site every year on the 26th of July. This could be the killer, or someone who knew her identity, or simply someone who just wanted to pay their respects, a good Samaritan. Personally, I think if it was the killer leaving the flowers, they would do it on the day of her death rather than the day that she was found in the dunes, but that's just me. It was probably just a good Samaritan. Despite being put to rest, the Lady of the Dunes has been exhumed multiple times over the years, the investigators looking for more evidence. The first time was in 1980, but nothing new was discovered. But then over the next 10 years, DNA technology took a huge leap, and so in March 2000 she was exhumed once again for DNA extraction. They wanted to test her DNA against that of a potential identity, Rory Jean Kessinger, who had escaped from a Plymouth prison a few months earlier, but it was not a match. But now at least they had her DNA on records. And then in 2010, the skull underwent CT scans in an attempt to create an accurate facial reconstruction, with the Provincetown Police Department releasing the new image of her in May of that same year, using new facial recognition software. She was exhumed for a final time back in 2013, although I couldn't find much information as to why she was exhumed this time, and it seemed like nothing ever came of it as she remains unidentified. At this time, they noticed that the metal casket that she'd been buried in was rusted and falling apart, so the Provincetown Police Department raised money for a new, sturdy coffin for her. It's been 45 years, but in terms of leads in this case, there's pretty much nothing. In 1987, there was a potential lead in the form of a Canadian woman in her early 20s who told her friend a strange tale about how she remembered seeing her father strangle a woman in Provincetown about 15 years earlier. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were notified about this and they called Chief Meade at Provincetown PD. But whilst this all happened, the woman moved town and the police lost contact of her. I don't think they were ever able to find her and this lead just vanished. Although, as Meade said, although our Jane Doe was indeed strangled, it was a blow to the head that killed her. Her death was incredibly violent. Perhaps the girl recalled the childhood memory incorrectly, but it's likely something as traumatic as that would be burned in her brain, not just a memory of strangulation. There was also a woman from Maryland who reported that she hadn't heard from her sister since she moved to Boston in 1974, the same year as the murder. Her sister matched descriptions of the Jane Doe, and so Meade told the woman to get hold of her sister's dental charts and send them over, but nothing ever came of this once again. Multiple missing people have been ruled out as being the Lady of the Dunes. Which leads us to a couple of theories, the most popular of which being the Jaws theory. Now, it was actually the son of famous writer Stephen King that brought this theory to light, which I think gave it a bit more credence than it probably would have gotten if it was literally anyone else talking about it. Back in 2015, Joe Hill, who is also an author, was watching Jaws for the first time when a woman caught his eye. A woman that he thought looked very similar to the recently released new composite sketch of the Lady of the Dunes. This woman appears at the beginning of the 4th of July scene, looking over her shoulder at the camera for just a few seconds before disappearing into the crowd. She was wearing a blue bandana, blue jeans, and was about 145 pounds and 30 years old. I mean, I can't deny that the woman does look a bit like the composite sketch, but then again, both are pretty generic faces. Jaws was shot between May and October 1974, about 100 miles south of Provincetown in Menemsha and Martha's Vineyard. Lady of the Dunes was found towards the end of July. Hill himself has admitted that this is a shot in the dark, even he is sceptical of his own theory, but it's something that he thought was worth following up on. Lots of locals were used during the filming of Jaws as extras, and so if this woman and Jane Doe really are the same person, she was likely from the area. While Steven Spielberg is one of the biggest directors nowadays, Jaws was one of his first ever films. His name wouldn't likely have drawn a huge crowd of people coming across the country to be in his films at this time. And the most interesting thing to me is that nobody's come forward with any information as to who this extra actually is, even if she's not Lady of the Dunes. There were multiple other people in the scene with her, and surely, if this woman was in Jaws, even for just a few seconds, this is something that she probably would have pointed out to friends and family. Why has nobody ever come forward being like, this is my Aunt Sally, she's alive, she's not the lady in the dunes? Maybe it is just a case of this theory not being widespread enough, but it seems like any effort to track down the name of this woman has failed. Extras weren't kept meticulous track of back in the 70s, and the film's cast and director has since passed away. I don't personally think there's much in this theory, but detectives have said they're willing to follow any evidence that comes their way. So if somebody comes forward with some interesting information in regards to this, they would be willing to look into it. I think the fact this happened in Cape Cod at the same time as Jaws being filmed is important though. If you have memories of being in the area at the same time that Jaws was being filmed, likelihood is that you were there at the same time the Lady of the Dunes was killed. Cape Cod was a very lively area, lots of bars and people out having fun. Somebody must have seen her. Other potential theories include a mobster called James Whitey Bulger. He'd apparently been seen around this time with women of similar description to the Lady of the Dunes. Whitey Bulger had a past as a male escort and was a regular at a popular LGBT bar, the Crown and Anchor. Provincetown was and is a very gay-friendly place, especially in the 60s and 70s. It was a safe haven in a world that wasn't all that safe for this community. He got his start as an escort as a teen after a lesbian pimp recruited him to hustle out of gay bars. Whitey worked at a couple of other bars as well, and it was noticed that he was a pretty violent guy. Now this theory comes from the word of an author called Sandra Lee, who has suggested that she was actually the first person to come upon the body of the Lady of the Dunes when she was just 9 years old, before the dog-walking teenager found it and reported it to the police. Sandra has said that she was in the brush, in the seagrass, about 15 feet from an access road. This road follows the backside of Dunes Edge campground, and she was in the thick of the brush, and it was her dog who discovered the body. Sandra has said this body was face down, her hair was a mess, and I could see a gouge in the right side of her neck. Her arms were tucked down in the sand, so I didn't know anything was missing. I recognised a green blanket right away. The lower half of the body was covered with something. She said that she never told anybody what she'd seen, and of course whether this was true or not cannot be confirmed as she didn't tell anyone if it did happen. Lee has said that her family would often camp at the Dunes Edge campground, which wasn't far from the dunes, and her stepfather would often hang out with Whitey Bulger in Provincetown drinking in the bars. She says that one night her stepfather stumbled back drunk with a green cotton blanket wrapped around his shoulders that he'd taken from the Crown and Anchor Inn. A very similar looking blanket to the towel that Jane Doe was found lying on, apparently. The police did seem to take this lead seriously when it all came out around 2012, with Detective Meredith Labor saying, "It's not a secret, it never was a secret, that James Whitey Bulger spent time in Provincetown. What our hope is, with his capture and imprisonment and his age, someone will finally come forward." Whitey Bulger was eventually captured for other crimes and sentenced to life in prison in 2013, but he died in 2018 and never mentioned anything of the Lady in the Dunes to anyone. He was involved in pretty much every crime there was. This was not a good guy, and there's rumours that he was involved in human trafficking as well. And he was known for removing his victims' teeth, which we know happened to Jane Doe. There are things that point towards this being a viable theory, there's just no evidence to prove it. And even if it was him, it provides us with no more information as to this woman's identity. The name Tony Costa also comes up in relation to this case often. He was a serial killer who operated in the area at the time, although they soon realised that he died in May 1974 and Jane Doe was found in July, so it couldn't have been him. Her decomposition was bad, but not that bad. So Tony Costa, not a viable theory, although you do see his name in relation to hers quite often. But finally we have the Haddon Clark theory, who was another serial killer. He was convicted of the murders of two people, 6-year-old Michelle Dorr in 1986 and 23-year-old Laura Houteling in 1992. He was sentenced to 2 30-year sentences for his crimes. Over his time in prison, Clark has confessed to murdering dozens of people, and in 2004 he sent a letter to a friend claiming that he'd been the one to kill the Lady of the Dunes. He said that he buried the evidence from this crime in his grandfather's garden and that he knew the woman's identity but would never tell the police because they'd mistreated him. But Haddon Clark suffers with paranoid schizophrenia, and so police have always doubted how true his confessions are. But then again, in the year 2000, he took the police to his grandparents' former house and they discovered a plastic bucket containing more than 200 pieces of jewellery, including items from Laura Houteling. He said that they were his trophies, so it seems he may have had way more than just 2 victims, but probably not as many as 200. But the police have never been able to confirm his involvement in the case of Lady of the Dunes though, because there's just no evidence of it. This is a guy who cries wolf quite often. As the years pass, it's harder and harder to find new leads, and even if there is a new lead, it's going to begin to get harder and harder to follow them to an end. As Chief Mead pointed out in an interview from the 80s, the best chance they have of identifying this woman is through her dental records. As more and more dentists from the 60s and 70s stop working or even die, there's going to be so many records, so much information lost. But someone somewhere out there must know who this woman was. She must have had relatives or friends or even casual acquaintances at some point. But that gets more complicated when you remember that investigators are sure that she was killed by someone who knew her, possibly while she slept. This person went to great lengths to cover their tracks, cutting her hands off and taking out her teeth. They probably told other people who knew her some elaborate stories to cover up her disappearance as well. But that's of course if we are to believe the police's theory that she was killed by someone who knew her. And I've got to say, I probably think that's the most likely scenario as well. Why else would somebody go to the effort of taking out teeth and cutting off hands? I mean, maybe you could say a few teeth could be a trophy, but the hands, probably not. I think this is a case that's only going to be able to be solved by exposure at this point. Just somebody who happened to know her coming forward to the police and saying this is who she was. Maybe they'll never be able to figure out who killed her, but I think it's so important to reunite her with her identity before it gets too late. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.